The message from Canada's incoming Prime Minister to the U.S. President this Wednesday night.
I'm ready to sit down with President Trump.
The conditions Mark Carney is setting and Canada's new tit-for-tat tariffs, plus how steel workers are reacting.
When you have a megalomaniac running the United States,
America gets tougher with long-term visitors.
A lot of them are confused and quite frankly, they're scared.
What Canadians will and won't have to do if they stay in the U.S. more than 30 days. Pushing for peace, the pressure on Vladimir Putin to accept the ceasefire plan, and forced to alter locations. Why a new church can't take over the space of an old one.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The global trade war started by the U.S. president is ramping up. Donald Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on all aluminum and steel imported into the U.S., including from Canada. Within hours, Canada retaliated with reciprocal tariffs, and so did the European Union. Trump says whatever they charge the U.S., he will charge them, and that countries will back down.
This is not going to be a tough battle. In my opinion, not going to be tough. Just like when Ontario charged us, everybody said, oh, they just charged. I said, this will be one in 1 hour. And they announced what we were going to do, and they withdrew their little threat.
That threat to put a surcharge on electricity sold to the U.S. came from Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He had breakfast with Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney today. Carney thanked Ford for standing up for Ontario. And on a visit to a Hamilton steel plant, Carney, who is set to be sworn in as Prime Minister on Friday, says he's ready to sit down with Donald Trump with conditions. David Aiken has our top story tonight.
Hours after the U.S. tariffs went into effect, the man who will soon be Prime Minister was in a steel mill with reassuring words.
We stand foursquare with you in this, and we are doing several things.
Morning, everyone.
That includes a new round of retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. imports.
What you're seeing today is leadership on the part of the federal government, and also we'll continue to work with the premiers that are showing leadership as well, because we need to fight back against this nonsense.
Two cabinet ministers and Ontario Premier Doug Ford will be in Washington Thursday to meet with Trump's Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Lutnick called Ford Tuesday to arrange that meeting after Ford had raised the price of Ontario electricity that goes to 1.5 million American homes by 25%. After that call, Ford agreed to pause Ontario's electricity export tariff, something Lutnick gloated about Wednesday on Fox Business.
He thought he'd be sort of the big man and tackle Donald Trump, but you know you can't tackle Donald Trump. He is the most important, the smartest, the most capable leader in the world, and he's not going to let someone push him around.
You know, if they want to call it a win, whatever. They're playing politics.
More important for Ford is the message Trump needs to understand. Canada will fight unjust U.S. tariffs that are not good for anyone.
It's American people that are going to get hurt. Canadians are going to get hurt. Let's sit down and start moving forward.
But that Washington meeting is only about removing these new steel and aluminum tariffs. It is not about renegotiating a trade deal. Mark Carney is not going to that meeting, but he is ready to go to Washington if one specific condition is met.
I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty.
And that last point is key. No Canadian politician, not Carney, not Pierre Poilievre, not any premier, will participate in any negotiation with a partner that is threatening to make Canada the 51st state. That kind of talk, Canadian officials say, simply has to end. Donna.
Okay, David Aiken in Ottawa, thank you. Canada is the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., and where this trade war is leading, the impact it could have on tens of thousands of Canadian jobs is deeply worrying, especially in Hamilton, Ontario. That is where Jeff Semple is tonight. Jeff.
Well, Hamilton is called Steel Town for a reason, Donna, home to the highest concentration of steel manufacturing in the country, and the community that could be hardest hit by these latest tariffs.
That's the Ontario rolling mills.
Hamilton's steel industry dates back to the 1800s, and for Stephen Lechiak, it runs in the family. He spent nearly 4 decades at this Hamilton steel plant, along with his brother and son. He's endured numerous layoffs and strikes, but nothing like this.
When you have a megalomaniac running the United States, and on a whim, he changes his mind, one day their tariffs are on, next they're off. It's very scary.
Talk about a roller coaster. They've gone through a lot.
The mayor of Hamilton says Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum could cost this region up to 28,000 jobs and $1 billion. 90% of Canadian steel exports go to the U.S.
I hope that they are able to resolve this because it is catastrophic for Hamilton.
But while some are making doomsday predictions, the industry has seen this movie before.
You will have protection for the first time in a long while.
In 2018, Trump also slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian steel. Those only lasted a year, and during that time, the number of steel industry jobs actually rose. The American owner of this Canadian steel plant thanked Trump for the tariffs.
We've got to build in America.
The CEO has promised not to cut Canadian jobs for at least 5 years. And at this point, local unions say they're not anticipating any layoffs.
They've had a hiring freeze, and they have cut a few shifts and nothing too drastic.
I'm not sure I believe there's going to be disastrous consequences, but I also don't think this is necessarily the end. So what's Mr. Trump going to do next?
Some experts say the greater threat to the steel industry could come on April the 2nd. That's when Trump has threatened 25% tariffs across the board, including the auto sector, which is the biggest buyer of Canadian steel. Donna.
Jeff Semple in Hamilton, Ontario, thanks. Europe is retaliating by imposing 26 billion euros worth of tariffs on a range of products, from American beef, poultry, peanut butter, bourbon and motorcycles, to jeans, vapes and communion wafers. Trump continues to falsely claim tariffs amount to a tax cut for Americans. Today, the European Commission president set the record straight.
Tariffs are taxes. They are bad for business and worse for consumers. They are disrupting supply chains. They bring uncertainty for the economy.
The UK did not announce retaliatory measures today. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he was disappointed but will take what he calls a pragmatic approach. All the economic uncertainty has shaken consumer and business confidence. To help offset what could be a coming economic crisis, the Bank of Canada has cut its key lending rate again, down from 3% to 2.75%. Mackenzie Gray explains what's behind the cut.
The 7th straight Bank of Canada rate cut would normally be something to celebrate, Donna, but Donald Trump's trade war has Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem sounding the alarm.
We are now facing a new crisis. Depending on the extent and duration of new U.S. tariffs, the economic impact could be severe.
A crisis that could see negative growth, increased prices, job losses, and a spike in inflation. A nasty combination that Canadians are bracing for.
Threats to new tariffs and uncertainty about the Canada-U.S. trade relationship are already having a big impact on business and consumer intentions.
A bleak sentiment backed up by a new Bank of Canada survey. 72% of Canadians expect the cost of living to increase, leading nearly a quarter to save more and put off a big purchase. Businesses aren't feeling any better. Roughly half say they plan to cut jobs and are holding off on investments, while 47% think their costs are going up, a bill that will be passed on to consumers.
Canadians don't want, on top of all the uncertainty coming out of the U.S., is another spout of inflation.
Harm the White House has always dismissed.
Tariffs don't cause inflation, they cause success.
Well, look, I'm going to let the U.S. administration speak for themselves.
But Macklem is clear. Concerns about tariffs pushing up inflation means the bank won't be the economic white knight it was during the Great Recession and COVID, when it slashed rates to rock-bottom lows.
This is really much in the camp of the federal government. The risk is a scenario where you have a recession and at the same time you have prices going up, and that's very unusual.
Where the bank goes from here, Donna, is extremely unclear, with Tiff Macklem providing no forward guidance about whether the bank would cut, hold, or even increase rates at their next meeting in April.
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa, thanks.
I'm going to say this at risk of my job, Kelly, but what President Trump is doing is insane.
It is absolutely insane. It is about the 8th reason we've had for the tariffs. And now he's saying he's putting 50% tariffs on Canada unless they agree to become the 51st state.
That's a longtime American business journalist at CNBC yesterday giving voice to what so many people, especially Canadians, are thinking. He says the president doesn't have anyone around him to rein him in the way Trump did during his first term. It's not just economic experts questioning Trump's art of the deal. While the U.S. president has long pointed to the surging stock market as proof of his business acumen, his threats and trade war have created uncertainty and volatility. Jackson Prosco looks at new polling that shows a growing number of Americans are unhappy with the president's handling of the economy. Jackson.
Hi, Donna. If we're talking about the economy, which is such a huge issue for voters, it seems the honeymoon may already be over for President Trump. A new poll shows Trump is already underwater on his handling of the economy. 56% of Americans disapprove of the job he's doing. Only 44% approve. That's despite the fact that his overall job approval is actually up 3 points since he took office to 45%. Now, we know Trump's own policies are largely to blame for the shaky markets and falling consumer confidence. Tariffs have rattled investors and will send prices surging, yet Trump remains undeterred.
If I didn't win the election, you would have had a very bad period. I think a lot of the stock market going down was because of a really bad 4 years that we had. When you look at inflation and all of the other problems, wars and inflation and so many other problems. But we're going to have very good years.
The polls are also flashing warning signs for Trump on another big issue, his proposal to make Canada the 51st state. A survey of Americans by Angus Reid found 60% say they have no interest in the proposal, and 32% say they would only be interested if Canada wanted to join the U.S. And yet 35% of respondents say they believe Trump is serious about annexation. That's up 12 points since January. No surprise here, Donna. A whopping 90% of Canadians oppose joining the U.S., and that number remains unchanged.
All right, Jackson in Washington, thank you. The U.S. Department of Education is the latest agency to be gutted by the Trump administration. More than 1,300 workers were fired Tuesday night, joining the nearly 600 who already accepted severance packages. The department started the year with more than 4,000 staff members. Donald Trump says he wants to dismantle the entire agency, which manages student loans, tracks classroom achievement, and enforces civil rights laws in schools. The BC government says the U.S. has paused negotiations on a decades-old treaty to share water. The Columbia River Treaty involves the Columbia River. It originates in southeastern BC and flows into the Pacific Ocean on the Oregon-Washington border. The treaty governs transnational flood control, power generation, and water supply. In July, the two countries reached an agreement on a new version of the treaty, but that was not finalized before Donald Trump took office. Canadians planning to travel to the U.S. and stay there for more than 30 days will want to take note of new American rules set to take effect next month. Neetu Garcha explains what they are and why some are already calling them unnecessary and confusing.
The U.S. is set to enforce a new visitor registration rule on April 11th, which could impact thousands of Canadians. Those planning to stay for longer than 30 days will be required to register with U.S. authorities.
There is no registration form and there is no process yet. The Department of Homeland Security has said that that's coming. It's not out yet.
If travelers fail to log their details with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they could face an up to $5,000 fine or be detained for up to 6 months, according to the U.S. Office of the Federal Register.
For Canadian snowbirds, they're the ones who are most alarmed. A lot of them are confused and quite frankly, they're scared.
The U.S. Department of Homeland Security telling Global News Canadian members of the Nexus program or those under the Visa Waiver program will not be impacted. It would also not apply to Indigenous people who meet certain conditions. Whether Canadians would be exempt from fingerprint requirements is not clear.
But what a Canadian could do to avoid being
called in to register like this is to ask for an I-94 when they do travel.
Canadians with an electronic I-94 document, which most get automatically when flying to the U.S., don't need to register. Canadians can prepare by checking their I-94 status online.
I'm not surprised. I think this was consistent with Trump's anti-immigration, but also the tariff policies.
And like those tariff policies, these experts say the new rules could change on a dime. This new registration rule could just be another reason for Canadians already feeling disillusioned by the economic tensions to stay away from the U.S. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
The ball is in Russia's court coming up, awaiting a response from the Kremlin on the Ukraine ceasefire proposal. The company that owns the cargo ship that crashed into a U.S. tanker off the coast of England says the captain is a Russian national. He is in police custody in the UK. A new thermal camera footage from a nearby vessel shows the impact and then the explosion. That oil tanker anchored off the east coast of England was carrying jet fuel for the U.S. Navy. One crew member is missing and presumed dead. The 59-year-old captain of the cargo ship is being held on suspicion of manslaughter by gross negligence. The world is looking to the Kremlin for a response to the ceasefire proposal agreed to in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday. The U.S. agreed to resume aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine in return for the country's acceptance of a 30-day ceasefire aimed at ending the years-long war, but only if Russia complies. Redmond Shannon reports.
The hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hit by a Russian missile attack. Rockets fired hours after the US and Ukraine agreed on a plan for a 30-day truce. Peace needs two sides to agree. I don't see such a will from the Russians, says this man. Zelensky says everything depends on what Russia wants now. His U-turn on accepting a truce followed pressure from the US, temporarily pausing its military aid and intelligence sharing. His enemy, Russian President Vladimir Putin, met with the head of Russia's armed forces in Kursk region Wednesday, the area where Ukraine seized Russian land last year. But there is evidence Russia is clawing that back, with Ukraine set to lose what could have been an important bargaining chip for Zelensky. On the streets of Moscow, some think this is not the time for a truce. It's unfair to accept a ceasefire when the enemy has been weakened, says this man. There is no official word from the Kremlin yet. White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff heads to Moscow this week.
People are going to Russia right now as we speak, and hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia.
Trump says he's had positive messages. He hasn't ruled out pressuring Russia to get on board.
In a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia.
Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists repeatedly violated previous ceasefire agreements in Ukraine's contested Donbas region. There is no detail yet on how any new 30-day truce would be enforced. As for Ukraine's long-term security, Zelensky says that could be negotiated if and when this pause comes into effect. Donna?
Redmond Shannon in London, thanks. Passenger train hijacked ahead the military operation in Pakistan to save hundreds of people taken hostage. Militants in southwestern Pakistan hijacked a passenger train, and the day-long standoff was terrifying for the 450 people on board. A separatist militant group blew up the track and then opened fire, taking hostages. According to Pakistan's security forces, 300 hostages were rescued, but not before militants killed 21 of them and 4 soldiers. Officials say all 50 insurgents are now dead and the ordeal is over. Greenland's election, which was dominated by the U.S. president's desire to take control of the island, had a surprise winner. The centre-right party won the most seats for the first time in that party's history. It favors a slow approach to independence from Denmark, but is against Greenland joining the United States. Trump has vowed to make Greenland part of the U.S. since his return to office. He says it's vital to U.S. security interests, Most Greenlanders reject that idea. Next, a Quebec church in need, why it was kicked out of its place of worship. A religious group in Quebec is looking for a new home. The Evangelical Baptist Church has been told it can no longer rent space in the basement of an old church. Quebec's secularism law means the 70-year-old former Catholic church cannot house anything religious. Mike Armstrong explains the conundrum.
It may have seemed like a match made in heaven. A local church, l'Église des Deux Rives, renting space in what was once the Christ-Roi Catholic Church.
On se rassemble.
We gather together, says Church Board President Patrick Héroux. There are prayers and singing, and we study the Bible.
Venez grimper au centre d'escalade Betacris.
Now, the building is owned by a climbing gym. It was deconsecrated and in 2017 found its new vocation. But it also has a basement. That space is rented by the municipality and can be subletted to other groups. L'Église des Deux Rives moved in 3 months ago. Its Facebook page invited people to Sunday services, pointing out parishioners should use the door to the basement. Well, they've now been asked to move out. Héroux says the church has been told the municipality can't rent its space because the church would be using the former church for religious purposes. Under the province's secularism law, the city of Saguenay has to be religiously neutral. The same rule applies to schools, which is why the church had to move out of its last location. It had been renting space in a high school. Héroux says the office has been helpful. It's offered them space to store their equipment temporarily. The climbing gym actually offered to rent them space upstairs, but it's too small. So the search for a new home continues. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. More Canadian pride in your Canada tonight. We have got Vic Cole Lodge near Powell River, BC, Woody Point, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Yellowknife's Snow Castle. Keep them coming. Send your pictures of Canadian pride to globalnational@globalnews.ca. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.